ricksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. Hospital workers are joining Fight for 15 and SEIU in a planned massive drive to unseat anti-worker politicians. SEIU and Fight for 15 say tens of thousands of workers are each pledging 40 hours to create a nationwide army of volunteers ahead of the 2018 elections. This huge worker political effort kicks off on Labor Day, when Fight for 15 will strike and protest in more than 300 cities. The workers have had it with politicians who use their power to block minimum wage increases and gut union rights. Pro-worker candidates for governor and other offices who support a $15 minimum wage will join the worker Labor Day protests at hospitals around the country. Workers launching this huge political effort believe that the first and foremost job of politicians is to improve the living standards of workers. A group of workers at a Target store in Christiansburg, Virginia, are on strike, demanding the firing of a manager. The workers are also demanding that Target recognize their independent workers committee to mediate between Target workers and management. The workers say there are multiple worker testimonies alleging that General Manager Daniel Butler is abusing workers through sexual harassment and racial discrimination. New River Workers Power is an independent local workers organization. One of the workers on strike is Adam, who declined to give his last name.
We actually had made contacts with people in the trailer parks around here who worked at Target, and they started telling us all these stories about this particular manager, Daniel Butler, and how he engaged in sexual harassment, making racist comments, placing his hands on workers, stuff like that.
Attempts were made to go through Target HR, but it went nowhere, so a small group of workers went on strike, picketing and leafleting the store this week. Adam says workers have power, even in small groups, if they are organized and determined, and he hopes what these workers are doing at the Target store in Christiansburg, Virginia, inspires other grassroots worker actions nationwide.
You just got enough small, committed people with a good strategy and game plan and able to execute that game plan. You can kind of punch beyond your weight in a way, and I think we're already kind of proving that. And social media is a very useful tool to help kind of make this local struggle go beyond just our town. It's gotten a lot of retweets and reshares through social media, and that we've helped raise funds for the strike fund, help get the word out to get people to call, participate in the phone blast, and let Target Corporation and the local store manager know that they support us, and just keep blowing up their phone lines and keeping the pressure on them.
You can go to nrvstrike.org for more information or to learn how to help these Target workers in Christiansburg, Virginia. That's nrvstrike.org. WIN is brought to you in part by the Amalgamated Transit Union, the largest labor union representing transit and allied workers in the U.S. and Canada. Online at atu.org. You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit workersindependentnews.com.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show.
I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
You bet I cut the taxes at the top.
How dare you? How dare you? Go ahead, make my day.
The Rick Smith Show starts now.
This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Lots to get to today on the program. Lots to talk about. But first, my head damn near exploded last night. Honestly, truthfully, one of those shots in the back, one of those stabs, almost a mortal blow, if you will. Yesterday, evidently in Simi Valley, California, at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, you had the Secretary of the Department of Labor. Again, I wasn't fond of Andy Pudster, the Hardee's CEO, being Secretary of Labor, but I said, look, you crushed him. The next guy's going to be just as bad, probably going to be worse. Well, what does Alexander Acosta do? And you go, who's Alexander Acosta? Well, Alexander Acosta is the guy who's the replacement for Andy Pudster. He is the current Secretary of Labor, and he has decided that Ronald Reagan will be in the U.S. Department Labor Hall of Fame. Let that sink in for a second. This is the guy. Understand, Reagan is the guy who the famous shot heard cross the boardroom when he fired more than 11,000 Patco workers who were on strike, not just for better wages and hours, but for better conditions. And not just conditions for themselves, but for safety for the flying public that, thanks to them, we have benefited from for the last 30 plus years. Because one of the things that they were fighting for were to get rid of the antiquated equipment that used to lose planes all the time. And you go, well, how do you lose a plane? Well, on the equipment that they had, quite easily. So on August 5th of 1981, when Ronald Reagan fired the Patco workers, that was the shot. And for that, and look, you go back to that period, union density was, right around a 25%. We still had a strong middle class. And it was that movement, that moment, that the assault on the middle class and the working class of this country began. Now, understand, the Labor Hall of Fame was supposed to be for people like, Cesar Chavez or Samuel Gompers or George Meany or, people who actually fought to make workers' lives better. In fact, they write that the hall was established, the Hall of Honor was established in '88 to honor Americans whose distinctive contributions have elevated working conditions, wages, and overall quality of life for working American families. And you go, did Reagan do that? No. In fact, what Reagan did, signed the Tax Reform Bill of '86 that taxed unemployment benefits for workers losing their jobs. At every turn, his policies, at every turn, have made American workers' lives that much worse. But hey, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. Remember? President of the Screen Actors Guild, to which his number two, an actor who I loved, James Garner, was his number two, wrote in his memoir, Ronald Reagan wasn't qualified to be governor, let alone president. He said, I was vice president of the Screen Actors Guild when he was president. Ronnie never had an original thought. We had to tell him what to say. That's no way to run a union, let alone a country. And you go back to the Reagan years, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, I stop and I think about this, and you go, Ronald Reagan in the Labor Hall of Fame is kind of like putting Trump in Mensa. I mean, at some point you got to go, what just happened? And here's the thing: if you thought Reagan was bad, and I thought he was horrible, Trump's going to be so much worse, and it's only been 7 months. Now, fortunately, I think we as a country are waking up to the reality is that this guy's just terrible. In fact, the most recent George Washington University poll found that 71% of voters say that, Trump's behavior is not something that you would expect from a president. 71%. Now, look, I think you could walk out on the street and ask 10 people if the sky is blue, and I doubt 7 of them give you that answer. 27% disagreed, thought he was very presidential. Again, the base. 68% of registered voters said that, Trump's actions and rhetoric could, accidentally get us into some type of international conflict, 29% disagreed. 42% are saying, hey, I approve of his job so far. 55% disagree with his approval. 56% say that he has not been an effective president. 39%, again, back to the base, say yes. 41% have a favorable view of Trump. 56% not so much. Look, the other Republicans are much worse. Paul Ryan only has a 36% approval rating. Tippy Turtle Mitch McConnell, only a 19% approval rating. And not surprising. Look, they've all been terrible. And this is one of those things where I said from the beginning, the Republicans controlled everything. They could easily steamroll whatever they want through. And yet, what do they choose to do? Bicker and fight. And while they're bickering and fighting, and now understand, this last election, in my view, and we can have a lot of discussion around that, in my view, was about the fact that we've got bad trade deals, we've lost manufacturing, the middle class is shrinking, the lives of the average Americans is getting worse, it's harder to maintain, it's harder to pay the bills, it's harder to put food on the table. And that was highlighted yesterday in a new report out by Career Builder. Career Builder points out that 78% of full-time workers in this country say that they're living paycheck to paycheck. Now, that's up from 75% last year. Now, you got Trump running out saying everything's better, everything's great. It's fabulous. Career Builder also says that 71% of all U.S. workers say they are now in debt, up from 68% last year. 46% say that's manageable. We can pay our bills. We can make it week to week. We can do that. 56% say they're underwater over their heads. 56% say they save less than $100 a month. Now, the reality is you need to have some savings for emergency, and so many families are a paycheck or two away from disaster, be it a healthcare bill, a car payment, a car repair, something, anything. One or two paychecks away from disaster. And it's just not, the poor working people at the bottom. It's just not the McDonald's people. It's all the way up to, people making over $100,000 a year. In fact, 1 in 10 people making over $100,000 say that they usually live paycheck to paycheck. 59% of them say that in that salary range are saying that they're in debt. Now, again, you come back to this, that household income has grown over the past decade, but nowhere near the cost of living. Nowhere near. And yet, if you look at the wage distribution in this country, the wealth of this country, how it's divided, overwhelmingly it goes to the top 1% of 1%. It goes to that stratified air way up there. Those really, really freaking rich people who we don't ever get to see. And why is that? Well, it's because union density has been destroyed. And again, I come back to Reagan. You go back to him. Union density was about 25% of the country at the time. It's down to 11% right now. And it's only because, look, more than a third of the public sector is unionized. Only about 6% of the private sector is unionized. As we're back then, you had 20% private sector union density, which meant that 20% of the unionized workers made good wages, good hours, good conditions, and 20% of the non-union workers did the same. So what you had is still a pretty sizable middle class. Now, not like you had back in the 60s, where you had 35% union density, which meant that you had 35% union workers making good wages, hours, and conditions, and 35% of the non-union workers making similar conditions, similar wages, similar benefits, which meant you had a middle class of about 70% of the population. No, we can't talk about that. And if you look at this latest graph, and again, the EPI puts this out all the time, because what's happened is we're right back to where we were during the Gilded Age. And now there are some who say, well, Rick, extreme wealth and desperation, that's the natural course of human history. We've always been in this world of you have a handful of the elite ruling class, the nobility, the kings, the queens, the princes, and then you have the paupers. You have the desperate. You have the poor. They'll always be among us. And it was just that one little blip during the FDR New Deal era that brought us the Wagner Act and the right to collective bargaining. We need to do away with that, get back to where the natural course of human history. And the question is that where we want to go? And I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can give me an email, rick@thericksmithshow.com, or call us 1-888-520-RICK, 1-888-520-7425. I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to get to some of this more today because this is just one of those topics that I don't think we talk enough about, especially as Labor Day comes up and just around the corner. But when we come back and talk about the Trump trade idea, are we scrapping NAFTA? Are we back to that? Celeste Drake from the AFL-CIO is going to be here to talk to us. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Disorder in the house. There's a flaw in the system. And the fly in the ointment's gonna bring the whole thing down. The gates are open. We've let the demons loose. The big guns have spoken. And we've fallen for the roof.
Well, I was going to terminate NAFTA as of 2 or 3 days from now. The president of Mexico, who I have a very, very good relationship, called me. And also the Prime Minister of Canada, who I have a very good relationship, and I like both of these gentlemen very much. They called me. And they said, rather than terminating NAFTA, could you please renegotiate? I like them very much. I respect their countries very much. The relationship is very special, and I said, I will hold on the termination. Let's see if we can make it a fair deal, because NAFTA has been a horrible deal for the United States. It's been very good for Canada. It's been very good for Mexico, but it's been horrible for the United States. And if you check my campaign, any of my speeches, I said I'll either renegotiate or I'll terminate. So they asked me to renegotiate. I will, and I think we'll be successful in the renegotiation, which frankly would be good because it would be simpler. But we have to make a deal that's fair for the United States. They understand that. And so I decided, rather than terminating NAFTA, which would be a pretty big, shock to the system, we will renegotiate. Now, if I'm unable to make a fair deal, if I'm unable to make a fair deal for the United States, meaning a fair deal for our workers and our companies, I will terminate NAFTA. But we're going to give renegotiation a good, strong shot. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to get that neat renegotiations a real shot. In Phoenix on Tuesday night, Trump said we're probably going to end up terminating NAFTA at some point. That was his offhand comment. Now, an unnamed Politico source who's close to the current negotiations is reported saying, quote, I don't know a single person with a working brain cell that thinks that's a good idea. It's a stupid message to send during negotiations, because evidently the negotiations are ongoing. And maybe the president just doesn't know. maybe or doesn't really even care. Now, the Canadian foreign minister said, our priorities remain the same and we'll continue to work hard to modernize NAFTA, supporting millions of middle-class jobs. A smart thing to say. The Mexican foreign minister, kind of the same thing. We're already in negotiations. Mexico will remain at the table with serenity, firmness, and national interest ahead. Diplomacy and, well, the child with the baby rattle. Just bizarre stuff. But here to talk about if there is a renegotiation to be had, I've asked our good friend Celeste Drake to come talk with us. She's the Trade and Globalization Specialist there at the FFL-CIO. Celeste, thanks for taking time for us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Tuesday, I guess we're just walking away. Is that what I got from the comment Tuesday?
I'm not sure how to interpret that comment. It's I think you're exactly right. It does not seem designed to get people in the room and really working on the very big changes that have to be made to NAFTA in order for NAFTA to become anything that could ever work for working people.
Now, yesterday it came out in the USA Today, your president, Richard Trumka, wrote in USA Today, the North American Free Trade Agreement has been an unequivocal failure, sending jobs abroad, holding down wages, and devastating communities. Only Wall Street and Washington elite can claim NAFTA is yesterday's war. It's a battle for American families today. And again, you go back to 2016, this was kind of what Trump ran on. Going to bring back manufacturing, which really hasn't happened. Going to renegotiate NAFTA. And it seems like he just keeps throwing wrenches into this stuff.
Well, he does. And it does have to make you question, why was NAFTA, why was TPP, why were these major elements in his campaign? Does he really understand how horrible they have been in helping to transfer production, what used to be good middle-class jobs in manufacturing from Mexico, from the United States to Mexico? Does he understand what's happened to wages for 2/3 of all Americans, even folks who don't live anywhere near the Midwest, and even folks who've never had a manufacturing job in their life? These are the critical pieces of NAFTA. Does he understand the box that has been put around the government policies for all three countries that's really an attempt by corporations to limit the ways that our democratic societies can regulate corporate behavior? The way that he talked about it, I think, made a lot of voters think he understands, he cares, he's going to fix this for us. And then when we see the negotiating goals published by his administration for NAFTA, those are not in sync. The negotiating goals, as you read them, could say, we're going to make this look exactly like the TPP, which was so awful that he rightly, withdrew U.S. participation from that agreement. So there's a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde thing going on, and I think, for the labor movement, what we're recommending folks do is sort of focus on the fact that it's being renegotiated, focus on the fact of what we want, what a real good working people's trade agreement should look like, which has to do with ever-rising standards for labor rights, for wages, for environmental protections, making sure that we can put needed regulations that protect our food safety, that protect product safety, that make sure that we can stabilize our economy when Wall Street's trying to drive it out of control. Focus on that. Yeah.
But here's the thing. I remember talking about this during the campaign, saying, do you really think a Republican president with a Republican Congress is going to be able to do any of those things? Because, historically they've been the party of big business. And you can look at these trade agreements as saying that, these have really been the handouts to the corporate global elites. It's what they want. We protect their profits. We destroy working conditions and environmental regulations. I see nothing positive coming from Trump or any of the Republican leadership.
Well, that's why I think focus on the negotiations rather than particularly what the president is saying, because I think the president's comments are a bit it's hard to follow. And the reason that working people are interested in trade and NAFTA is not because the president's interested. It's because we've been interested for the past quarter century, because we've known what a big threat and how devastating it would be for the past quarter century. Now, in terms of, working people should never trust, any politician to just fulfill promises. It doesn't happen that way. We have to push and agitate and show that working people do have power, and that power needs to be listened to move things in the right direction.
Right.
So I think that's really the focus. And, there are folks of goodwill on both sides of the aisle, and there are folks who, like to enact a Wall Street agenda, unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle. On trade, working people generally have a majority of elected Democrats in Congress with them. They generally have a tiny minority of elected Republicans in Congress with them. And what we have to focus on is how do we tell our story, not the Wall Street story, tell our story about what's wrong with trade, and make sure that members of Congress are pushing the negotiators, that the negotiators are not saying things like, oh, no one with a brain would ever want to pull out of NAFTA. I mean, that you can only say that if you're sort of have taken on the Wall Street mindset, where what's good for business is good for the country. That's a trickle-down approach. We have, 25 years of evidence that trickle-down trade doesn't work, and it's got to be changed. And quite frankly, in the end, if these negotiations go in the wrong way and they do produce, TPP, the sequel, then we're going to be in a place where we are fighting to stop that and to, end NAFTA as we know it, because NAFTA either has to change and really benefit working people and incentivize good jobs and good wages, and in fact, new investment in the U.S. and Canada, and not only in Mexico, or it's just going to continue to be this driver of the race to the bottom.
I agree with you, but here's the thing. I mean, you said, we have to, send that message, and I think Trump did. I think Trump took labor's message during the 2016 campaign and talked about why NAFTA was bad and why we needed to renegotiate. But my problem is that, as you pointed out, that what so far is coming out of this is not in our interests. And you look at what he's doing domestically with attacking overtime rights and going after the safe workplaces executive order that President Obama put into place. It seems like every step forward that labor has had through the last administration, this guy's undone.
Yeah, well, I mean, taking our talking points and taking on our analysis and our policy preferences, those are different things. I mean, clearly, it was clear that TPP was unpopular and that talking about trade was going to be helpful with voters. I mean, that was clear. Bernie Sanders was being quite successful in his analysis of trade and TPP. And that's where I say we have to get past what are the talking points, what are the campaign promises, and actually doing the work that we need to do to either make sure those promises are fulfilled or exposing where they're not. But it's never enough to say NAFTA is a disaster. Well, what do you mean by that, and how would you change it? Because if the changes make it more corporate, then, it's clear that was just something to get people to listen to you and maybe give you the benefit of the doubt. But the proof is in the pudding, and if the rules being put on the table are rules that, hey, happen to give pharmaceutical companies more monopoly power to raise our drug prices, if the rules happen to be, let's give Wall Street banks even more influence and power over our economy and power to fight good regulations, then we start seeing the truth. So we have to look deeper, and be good citizens to say it's not just about what somebody says at a campaign rally. It really is about how do they govern and what rules are they putting on the table. And if they are not rules that really put working people's interests first, they're not going to be good rules. And we have to see past the rhetoric and the talking points of NAFTA is a disaster into how are we going to fix it? Because what we need is an economy that works for all the working people across North America.
Because we're not opposed to trade, right? I mean, if trade done right benefits everyone. I mean, that whole rising, tide lifts all boats theory, right?
Well, absolutely. Trade is good. Think about, your day and what you eat and drink every day, or the products that you might buy on a weekly or monthly basis. A lot of those are things that's really helpful to have international trade. Coffee. We don't grow coffee in the continental United States. It's all imported from somewhere. If you eat bananas and lots of fruit. So trade is good, and trade can be good for jobs and wages. But it depends what the rules are. If the rules say to companies, if you choose to offshore your production outside the U.S., you're going to be able to export it back to the U.S. tariff-free, so no taxes on it, and you can treat those workers in the other country pretty much any way you want, and you can treat the environment in the other country pretty much any way you want. And we're going to give you this special privilege when you can't get your way in the foreign economy, that you have access to a private justice system where you can sue because something they do is, quote unquote, not fair. It violates your right to fair and equitable treatment. And even the fear of that lawsuit could force that government to change the law or the regulation that you don't like. Then we are setting up, quite purposely, a race to the bottom. Then it's not an accident and it's not a surprise that it's harder to organize in the U.S., that it's harder to get a good contract for working people who do have a union, that it's harder to incentivize the investment here unless our states and localities are doing crazy things like giving away, all of their tax revenue, and essentially bribing the companies to invest. That's because the rules were set up wrong. But trade could be set up, you can imagine, and it hasn't been done this way because the corporations have been in charge of trade policy, but you could set up rules that say, these are our labor standards, they will be enforced, and they will get better over time. So as countries are doing better and developing more, we're going to make the labor rules more stringent. Why? To make sure that the wealth that's being created is being shared with working people. You could set up rules to say, as we're trading, we're also dealing with climate change. Why? Because right now we have a system where the ships that take the goods back and forth between countries for trade often are the most polluting. They're using the worst fuel, and they're in the least good repair, and they're really contributing to pollution and climate change. Well, why don't you have rules that try to offset that and account for that and say we can trade, but we can do it in a much more responsible manner to the climate and to the environment? You can have those rules, right? But we don't. And we don't have them because, we have not yet been able to focus attention on the fact that these rules matter. And it's not just a game where you say anybody who's smart always supports trade. It doesn't matter what the rules are. Because that's a game that the business community is playing, and they've been winning. Because, unfortunately, a lot of our elected officials are buying into that. They want to be smart. They want the business community to think that they're smart. So they start saying, oh, yes, yes to everything trade without looking into the details. And it's a thing that they would never do, many of them, when it's a health bill or a tax bill or an education bill. They would dig into the details and they would fight harder for better and fair rules. But on trade, somehow there's a free pass, and somehow the business community is getting, historically everything they want. And that can't happen. It's not sustainable for our economy.
Well, I would argue that has a lot to do with the fact that you've got people like the Koch brothers who have been spending so much money in American universities, especially in economics departments and business departments all across this country, training us as students, training us as a society to believe that, any regulation, any minimum wage, any labor law, any environmental protection, any of this stuff is bad for business, is a negative, and it's horrible, and it has to be done away with. And that's that's the only way that we can get rid of them, is have these kind of race to the bottom trade agreements. And look, this is one of the things that I bash Bill Clinton about. Clinton signed it, pushed it through. He owns it as much as George H.W. Bush did, as much as Ronald Reagan did.
Oh, absolutely he does. And we fought him at the time and told him at the time this is a big mistake. You cannot listen to this. And what's interesting is that every prediction that we made about NAFTA driving down wages and really polluting the environment, particularly in the border zone where a lot of the maquiladoras are, all of those came true. And actually, I think for many people, NAFTA's turned out to be far worse than people even expected. And so, yeah, people need to be held accountable for when they just simply believe talking points and don't get into the details, because the details matter. And you're right, it's a story that's being told across the economy, not just in the trade area. And what's interesting is we now have, several decades of evidence of what our economy looks like when it's not adequately regulated, when we're not adequately asking corporations to pay a fair share in taxes, when we're not paying people adequately and on a fair basis based on how productive they are. We have evidence that this drives down wages, destabilizes the financial sector, and really makes the entire economy grow slower. If you want to look at our last period of great growth, it was back when we said regulations are important, unions are important, high wages for working families are important. And yet, you still have to have this debate about, well, but theory says, it's like, okay, theory's wonderful, but now we have evidence that your theory is false. And we continue to fight the same battles. And it's quite frustrating, but that's why we ask folks to really engage. If you're talking about education and you say, I want education reform, people don't say, oh, well, you must not understand education. You must be anti-education. They understand that you want to reform it. And that's our argument about trade. It's not about stopping trade. It's about not about not understanding. We get it. And in fact, we get, the U.S. economy is relied upon to consume 20 to 25% of the world's output. We've got this powerful consumer base where we're consuming the things that the rest of the world is making. Well, that's already cutting off, and that's part of the reason the whole worldwide economy is slowing down. And how are we going to rely on American families to be such great consumers of the products of the world if our entire economy is geared toward pushing down our wages? In fact, to keeping people out of the middle class and limiting their opportunities for growth. And that's how our economy is set up. And sure, some people succeed even under this rigged economy, and that's great. But the system is not designed to give all of us a fair shot and to ensure that all of us, no matter how hard we work, live decent lives. And that's where unions come in, and we've got to make sure that workers have a fair right to organize and have a fair right to get the rules that we want, where we do regulate and tax and trade fairly. And that's what it's all about. Yeah. And right now, that's really at risk. And there is this opportunity. And like I said, no one's going to come in and be our savior on NAFTA. It seems like all three countries that are in NAFTA, people can think back to a year, 2 years ago. They're three countries that were saying how great TPP was. And we saw through that. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want NAFTA to be negotiated only in the interest of the corporations and have to fight it again. So now is the time to pay attention and speak up and tell those members of Congress, do your duty, have some oversight over this, and don't let this become, sort of just a repeat, a sequel of bad trade disasters of the past. We really need time and attention to make this something that could work for workers, because that could be fantastic. Imagine if workers across North America actually had a fair shot to make a fair wage and could earn a decent living, where they are, rather than having to, migrate or move somewhere else, or think about, well, maybe my kids will move away and they'll have a shot, but I'm never going to have one. Those are really depressing thoughts. And, doesn't have to do with people's personal failings. It has to do with our economy not being set up in a fair way. And a new NAFTA is a great opportunity to try and do that. But we can't look for, a savior to do it for us. We have to be our own working class heroes.
So how do we push for this? I mean, we've talked a lot about what, politically what's wrong. We've talked a lot about what's wrong with NAFTA itself. What are we pushing for? Because a lot of people think we've gone to school, we've taken Econ 101, free trade is good. We've got the bumper sticker slogan. What's the response that we take back to our elected officials in pushing them in the right direction?
Yeah, so we tell them, hey, we did take Econ 101. Free trade is good, but that chart that you learned in Econ 101 made a lot of assumptions. It made assumptions like that the producers weren't moving across borders to get access to the cheapest labor. It made assumptions that currency would fluctuate fairly so that you could offset trade imbalances. There are a lot of assumptions in that model that actually aren't true in the real world. And so what we say to them is, to be a new NAFTA, start with a few basic rules. Ensure there are rules so that currency policies are fair and they address misalignment and manipulation, because if currency can't adjust in a fair way, you're going to have these long, sustained, large trade deficits that the U.S. has had. You've got to get rid of what's called ISDS, and that's what I referred to before. It's the system of private justice for foreign investors, and essentially it's a tool to push around governments and get what you want. And so that has to be out, eliminated completely, no ISDS. You have to have, strong environmental and labor rules that aren't just quote-unquote enforceable, because what we've seen is, sure, everyone will say it's great, it's enforceable, and then it never gets enforced. You've got to have rules that are specific enough to say how employers can and can't treat working people, to defend their fundamental rights. These are internationally recognized rights. And when governments are not holding the employers accountable for mistreatment, abuse, and exploitation of workers, that there are penalties, and those penalties are swift and they are certain. They're not things that can be just ignored. They have to be enforced, not just enforceable. And then you have rules to say, we're not going to give away our opportunity to create jobs through fiscal policy, so that we can put Buy America and Buy American requirements on when the government spends money. Why? Because you create jobs in your own country when you do that. And that needs to be an option. You say we have strong rules of origin, so you're not getting leakage in from other countries. If the weaker the rule of origin, the more that a product can be made in China or Thailand or Bangladesh and count as an American product, and therefore get the tax benefits. So those are the things. The AFL-CIO has a list of, 18 things that we think are required to do in the NAFTA negotiations. You can find those on our website, aflcio.org. And if you just Google AFL-CIO NAFTA recommendations, you can find the 50-page version and the 2-page version of our recommendations, and talk to members of Congress and say, these are the key things that we want. And actually, we want to talk to you after every negotiating round, like the one that just finished, and talk about what was done right and what was done wrong. And the big thing that was done wrong in that first one was it wasn't open and transparent and democratic as we had recommended. So they're continuing the process of having these talks behind closed doors, which then makes it really hard for us to go in and measure, well, did you do what we asked you to do on the rules of origin and the procurement and, all of those things. So do those things. We've got a petition that folks can sign at the AFL-CIO.org website on trade, that people can sign and sort of get involved in the process. There are going to be more opportunities coming up for getting involved in your local communities and going and visiting your members of Congress and saying, we need you to be involved here. And I think there are going to be more opportunities leading up to the AFL-CIO's convention in St. Louis at the end of October. So I would say to folks, visit our website, get involved. Call your local Central Labor Council and ask how you can be involved. And there's a lot to be done, but it's going to take, members of Congress knowing that voters are interested, that voters are paying attention, and then they'll have an opportunity to put the pressure on the negotiators directly to say, we don't want another TPP. That's not acceptable.
There you go. Good stuff, and we'll make sure we get links at thericksmithshow.com. Celeste, I appreciate you taking time for us, sharing the thoughts, giving us the marching orders. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Always great talking with you. Celeste Drake, she's the Trade and Globalization Specialist there with the AFL-CIO. Quick break, right back.
Exposing that free trade is never free. The Rick Smith Show.
I hate to say this, but I'm starting to feel sorry for Donald Trump. He's only been in office for half a year, and already he's running out of Americans to attack. Of course, he came into office already having notched his AK-47 Twitter rifle with hundreds of hits on the American citizenry, including such entire groups as nasty women, Mexican Americans who have Latin-sounding names, and Muslim Americans who are, Muslims. The trigger-happy tweeter-in-chief also relishes gunning down his own political kin. One, he blasted all House Republicans who voted for a, quote, mean health care bill after he had personally pushed them to pass it. Two, he called for Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell to commit political hara-kiri for failing to pass his abominable Trump Care bill, which was meaner than mean. And three, he publicly shoots down his own top appointees, from Attorney General Jeff Sessions to his short-lived mouthpiece, Anthony Scaramucci. Then came the great Donald debacle, his bumbling, shameful response to the racist, anti-Semitic rampage in Charlottesville by a menagerie of neo-Nazis, KKK thugs, and swastika-clad white supremacists. His empathy with these far-right extremists was so appalling that even his multimillionaire allies in Fortune 500 corporations gagged. Led by Merck CEO Kenneth Frazier, Trump's two big corporate advisory panels abolished themselves in protest. The petulant president, clueless as usual about political symbolism, tweeted an angry potshot at Frazier, who happened to be one of only two African Americans on Trump's 47-member corporate committees. This is Jim Hightower saying, but our foam-at-the-mouth president still has one loyal friend by his side, Ku Klux Klan poobah David Duke. Perfect. They deserve each other.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
The most important issues of the day. This is the Rick Smith Show.
Smithshow.com. So I'm guessing the administration is admitting that Mexico is not paying for the wall, because you look at the Daily News front page today, Trump steps up, shocking threat, build my wall or I'll kill this government. And look, I guess he's coming to the reality. You had Kellyanne Conway on with Fake News and Friends. Said he's going to stick to building that wall, and he wants the money to pay for it. Again, thought it was coming from Mexico. I guess not. Anyway, let's find out what's going on in Washington, D.C. and around the world. Michael Esker, Talk Media News. Michael, thanks for taking time for us. All right, I guess we've lost Michael. But yeah, you go back to this. This moment. Where evidently Goldman Sachs is saying it's about a 50-50 shot that there's going to be a government shutdown, up from a 30% shot just back in May. I think we got Michael back on the line. Michael, are you there?
Yeah, I want to talk about this Mexican wall, but a couple of late-breaking remarks as the fallout continues from Charlottesville. Gary Cohn, one of the top economic advisors to Donald Trump, expressed today, said he felt compelled to voice his distress over Charlottesville, said he's going to hang in there, but he is very upset over Trump's failure to distinguish between neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and those who are fighting them. And John Danforth, former Republican senator, has a piece in the Washington Post today where he says, our party has been corrupted by this hateful man, the most divisive politician since George Wallace. So this he continues, Donald Trump, to have major problems with people in his own party, criticizing House Speaker Paul Ryan and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, both of whom he needs for this Mexican wall, because as you pointed out, all through the campaign we kept hearing, we're going to build this wall, and who's going to pay for it? Mexico. Well, what a load that is. And of course there was this phone conversation several weeks back where the president of Mexico said, I'm not going to pay for that wall, and Donald Trump said, okay, but don't tell anybody that. And now he is saying, hey, if Congress doesn't give me the money for it, I'm going to shut down the government. I don't believe that either. Imagine millions of people not getting their Social Security checks because the government is shut down. Imagine the shock on Wall Street as stocks plummeted if he shut the government down. Imagine all the services that we count on from the government if it was shut down. So he's not going to do that, but it continues to show us that he is at war with his own party. And, we didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier in the week, but for him to go to Phoenix, Arizona, home to two Republican senators, one of whom, John McCain, is fighting brain cancer, going through chemo. At the same time, we lose two sailors from a ship that was named for Senator McCain's father and grandfather, and all Donald Trump can do, can't bring himself to mouth a moment's empathy, however insincere it might be, about Senator McCain or about those 10 sailors. Instead, gives us some glib sneer at Senator McCain for not voting the right way on health care, and gives us another sneer about Senator
Flake, Jeff Flake.
He is at war with his own party, and as we go into September, expects to get something done, whether it's on the Mexican wall or immigration or health care or anything else. When he's fighting with his own people, I don't know how he expects to get anything accomplished.
I mean, I'm happy to see this kind of infighting, because maybe the ugly stuff that I was expecting doesn't happen.
Right.
Maybe the really ugliness doesn't happen. I'm expecting the tax thing to go through, because Republicans, no matter what, they're going to sell their soul to the devil to get tax breaks for the very wealthy. But the other stuff, I'm hoping, maybe we slow this stuff down, 2018, take back some control, and maybe then Trump, is the wheeler and dealer that everyone was hoping and thinking he might be.
Except that this fallout continues, and when you've got people like Bob Corker, who is openly, and James Clapper, openly questioning whether this guy is sane, whether he's got the emotional equipment to do this job. When you've got people like that openly saying it, and you remember that dossier from last winter, the one put together by the guy from MI5, the British intelligence,
yes,
and the investigative reporter from the Washington Post, and he testified behind closed doors this week. And this Glenn Simpson, formerly with the Wall Street Journal, he testified in private for 9 or 10 hours behind closed doors to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he gave them 40,000 pages of documents. This is not just about the salacious stuff that we were all whispering about last winter, but about alleged collusion between the Trump people and Russia. And last night, Chuck Grassley went to a town hall meeting back in Indiana, and a citizen stood up and said, "Are we ever going to find out what was said behind closed doors?" And Grassley said, I don't see why not. I guess we have to check with Simpson's lawyers to see if it's okay with them. And halfway through Rachel Maddow's show on MSNBC, she said, "We just got an email from them saying, yeah, sure, you can release the transcripts." If those transcripts are released, you know, the FBI already knows the contents, but we don't.
Right.
Imagine the impact that they might have if they are released, 9 or 10 hours of transcripts. So, and that's the stuff that Jim Comey, the former FBI chief, gave to Trump, who then fired him. He wouldn't put the clamp on the Russia investigation. He's angry with McConnell because he won't put the clamps on the Russia investigation. If he keeps trying to get people to shut down the Russia investigation, that's getting real close to attempted obstruction of justice. So on all of these counts, it seems to me he's getting really, really shaky here.
Yeah, I mean, again, the more the news tightens, the more the things get, the more that comes out, the more we find out. The more desperate I think he comes, and the more I think we start seeing some real insanity then.
And the tougher it becomes for him to get anything done, including some legislation that people like you and me would be just as happy not to see passed.
I'm with you. There's a lot of stuff I don't want to see passed, but to me already the damage has been done. And look, even if we do impeach this guy, even if we do impeach him and Mike Pence, we still end up with crazy, and we still have a Supreme Court justice who is going to, for the next 40 years, change the complexity of this country.
That work is done, but it might be nice to have a grown-up in the White House. But, look, this is a guy still in denial over the remarks that he made about Charlottesville. I mean, that speech in Phoenix the other night, you and I have been watching politics for a long time. I have never seen a political speech with such naked, transparent lying as there was the lying by omission.
Yeah.
The remarks that he made and failed to refer to in defending himself as though America has no collective memory.
Well, personally, I think his supporters don't. And that speech was not about you or me or anyone who pays attention. That was purely talk radio version of putting the red meat out to the base and getting them all foamed up and lathered up and twisted in the panties, man. That's what it was all about. It wasn't about you and me.
Yeah, but I wonder because I didn't watch Fox. I wonder what kind of coverage they gave him, whether they went along with it or pointed out that the key phrases that got him in trouble, he skipped over.
Yeah, no, it was glowing. I actually watched it. It was glowing. It was a great speech. He said what had to be said. Just bizarre stuff. Michael, I appreciate the time, man. Thanks so much.
Have a good weekend.
You as well. Our good friend Michael Esker. Quick break. Right back.
Radio of, for, and by we the working people. The Rick Smith Show.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. Hospital workers are joining Fight for 15 and SEIU in a planned massive drive to unseat anti-worker politicians. SEIU and Fight for 15 say tens of thousands of workers are each pledging 40 hours to create a nationwide army of volunteers ahead of the 2018 elections. This huge worker political effort kicks off on Labor Day, when Fight for 15 will strike and protest in more than 300 cities. The workers have had it with politicians who use their power to block minimum wage increases and gut union rights. Pro-worker candidates for governor and other offices who support a $15 minimum wage will join the worker Labor Day protests at hospitals around the country. Workers launching this huge political effort believe that the first and foremost job of politicians is to improve the living standards of workers. A group of workers at a Target store in Christiansburg, Virginia, are on strike, demanding the firing of a manager. The workers are also demanding that Target recognize their independent workers committee to mediate between Target workers and management. The workers say there are multiple worker testimonies alleging that General Manager Daniel Butler is abusing workers through sexual harassment and racial discrimination. New River Workers Power is an independent local workers organization. One of the workers on strike is Adam, who declined to give his last name.
We actually had made contacts with people in the trailer parks around here who worked at Target, and they started telling us all these stories about this particular manager, Daniel Butler, and how he engaged in sexual harassment, making racist comments, placing his hands on workers, stuff like that.
Attempts were made to go through Target HR, but it went nowhere, so a small group of workers went on strike, picketing and leafleting the store this week. Adam says workers have power, even in small groups, if they are organized and determined, and he hopes what these workers are doing at the Target store in Christiansburg, Virginia, inspires other grassroots worker actions nationwide.
You just got enough small, committed people with a good strategy and game plan and able to execute that game plan. You can kind of punch beyond your weight in a way, and I think we're already kind of proving that. And social media is a very useful tool to help kind of make this local struggle go beyond just our town. It's gotten a lot of retweets and reshares through social media, and that we've helped raise funds for the strike fund, help get the word out to get people to call, participate in the phone blast, and let Target Corporation and the local store manager know that they support us, and just keep blowing up their phone lines and keeping them pressure on them.
You can go to nrvstrike.org for more information or to learn how to help these Target workers in Christiansburg, Virginia. That's nrvstrike.org. WIN is brought to you in part by the Amalgamated Transit Union, the largest labor union representing transit and allied workers in the U.S. and Canada. Online at atu.org. You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit workersindependentnews.com.
I got a working class blues. I work all day to take all my class. I got a working class blues. I work all day to take all my class.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. So, the war on the Obama legacy continues. Remember, they went after the Safe Workplaces Act that said, hey, you know what? The Fair and Safe Workplaces Act that said, hey, if you're going to get a federal contract, you should pay reasonable wages, safe working conditions. There should be a standard, a floor beneath the feet of workers doing work with federal money. Seems sane, seem rational. No, we want desperation, going after the overtime changes, going after all of the steps forward, as small as they were for working people during the Obama years, undoing all of that. And evidently today, effective today, the U.S. Department of Transportation is no longer supporting the local hire program that the Obama administration put forth with cities who receive federal money. Again, why would we want to use federal money in a smart way? Why would we want to do that? It's better to have that race to the bottom, desperation kind of scenario. Here to talk about today's changes, I've asked Catherine Hoff to come talk with us. She's the national policy staff person with the group Jobs to Move America. Catherine, thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you.
So walk me through this. What was the policy? What had Obama put forth? What was the policy? What was the goal?
So legally, there were actually two things going on. One was that the Department of Transportation under Obama was trying to change the Code of Federal Regulations in order to make it easier for local hire to go forward. There's a section of the CFR that applies to all grants that entities receive from the federal government. And the Obama administration was trying to say that they would no longer prohibit geographic preferences in that particular rule. So that's what's being changed. The DOT is no longer trying to make it easier to have geographic preferences in grants that go through to state and local entities.
So now we're going to go back to the Reagan era idea of, I guess, transient labor coming through doing projects. What's the move then?
Yeah, our organization has done a whole series of research on this somewhat arcane but actually really important rule from the Reagan administration that basically defines competition as kind of, procedural, like you would think, right? We don't want anybody to have an unfair advantage, but then also substantive, which under the Reagan administration, they interpreted that to mean that you can't impose any conditions on the bidding process that would interfere with the free market. So we're back to that interpretation of the rule. Nothing can impose a burden on the free market, which also means that it's going to be harder for local and state governments to impose any socially beneficial policies attached to these bids.
So basically, we could have who knows where from who knows what doing these things. And, it's always been my view, Catherine, that, we use tax dollars, we use federal, state money, whatever, to raise conditions up, to make sure that what we need, what we build actually benefits us beyond just the item that we're building. And because I believe having a local, for instance, in construction, to have a local trade craft to be able to build, a new school or a new road or bridge is not just good in getting the new road, bridge, or school, but in having a local construction industry that's, one, capable of doing it, and two, has a vested interest in doing it well.
Absolutely. And, the DOT is signaling today that they're not interested in project labor agreements, and they're not interested in anything that might, help local hire, which is, as you point out, ridiculous because local communities are paying taxes. Why shouldn't they have the opportunity to benefit from taxpayer money?
Yeah, I mean, I look at this, and again, it's just another one of those slices at the Obama administration's legacy to take workers back another step. Because look, and you can agree or disagree. I don't think we got all that much further during the Obama years. These small steps forward were just that small, but still a step in the right direction. This stuff is just taking us backwards, and I think even further backwards than we started from.
Absolutely. This takes us back to the 1980s and the really draconian policies of the Reagan administration.
So what can we do is there something we can do to change this, to stop it? Anything we can do to push forward?
We need to call our Congress folks and make them aware of this. There are several workarounds that local and state governments can do in the meantime, and we're happy to talk further with folks about those. But really, we need to make Congress aware of this issue and turn the heat up.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, I think most people are like me. You want to have your neighbors building your stuff. You want to make sure that the investments you make in your community, reverberate through because, hey, the job that may be created or saved, hey, it might even be your own.
Absolutely.
Just, again, another amazing moment. Catherine, I appreciate you taking some time for us, sharing this information and helping us figure it out. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
But again, you go back to this, and, I've talked about this for, quite some time. As she pointed out, they're doing away with PLAs, project labor agreements, which we know actually does work in the interests of we the people. Project labor agreements make sure that all of the conditions that workers work under are safe, sane, rational. We find time and time again that projects done with project labor agreements are done on time, below budget. In fact, most of the time done below budget and sooner because you're dealing with much more qualified people doing these jobs. And again, you go back to this idea of having a local, especially when you're talking about construction, a local trade industry, having local construction workers and not these transient labor crews coming through who, they'll slap up their building and it's on to the next place. Slap up that school who, your kids are going to sit in there. Personally, I've always said that, I want somebody who, if someone's building that roof, someone's putting that building together, their kids should be sitting in that classroom as well. Because I think they would take a little bit extra time to build it well, to make sure that the roof doesn't come crashing in. It's not just about, hey, a quick paycheck and on to the next place. And when you see this kind of stuff, look, we know that when we spend money, when the federal government spends money in a community to build something, there's a reverberation effect that you want to keep local. You want that money to remain in a community, to have that reverberation effect, to raise up the entire economy. Be it, diners and restaurants and local stores and hotels and, whatever, movie theaters and you name it. Because where those workers earn those dollars, they spend in the community and it reverberates through. So when I see this kind of stuff, it's infuriating. It's really, really that kind of infuriating. And it's all been kind of slapdash. But it's this view of, it's the free market. And when you hear about the free market, think race to the bottom. Because when they talk about, anything that has infringes on the right of the free market, which means, labor and environmental standards, minimum wage, maximum hour laws, all of those things that the Trump people are trying to undo. I go back to that moment during the Obama years where we were talking about raising the threshold for people who could be exempt from overtime. Right now, someone making $23,660 a year can work 100 hours a week, just as long as they're considered assistant manager. They're given a cute little tin thing to put on their shirt that has their name and assistant manager on it, or supervisor. That little tin, that little plate, that little name tag, that entitles you to be exploited and make $23,660 a year. Now, the Obama folks said, you know what? We need to raise that limit. We need to stop allowing workers to be cheated. We need to stop with the wage theft and the misclassification. And we need to say, you know what? That number, you want to make people exempt from overtime, you got to pay them over $47,000. And the world went crazy. Oh my gosh, it's going to kill the economy. No. What that said is, look, if you want people to truly be management, you want them to truly be a supervisor, you got to pay them accordingly. And if you want to continue to pay them $23,600 a year to be an assistant manager, you break that up into hourly wages. And you can't work them 60, 70, 80 hours a week anymore. And if you do, you have to pay them overtime. That's all. It was not that difficult to understand. It was a very simple concept. And yet the right wing and Republicans lost their ever-loving freaking minds. Obama's destroying work. They're killing people who want to move up into management. And you go, no, I want people to move up into management. They should be paid accordingly. You shouldn't have to go, I'm now management, but I can be exploited and cheated. It's dumb. But again, it's what has happened in our country, and I don't understand the thought process. I don't understand why there isn't more outrage at what's happened to our labor laws. And when we come back, I'm going to get into a little bit more of this because, you've had this ossification of our labor law for so long, where you go back to Taft-Hartley and all of the death of 1,000 paper cuts, to the right to strike, to the right to organize, to the right to bargain collectively. It's something that this generation, seriously, going to have to find. Let's take a quick break. Right back. Stick around.
Disorder in the house. There's a flaw in the system. And the fly in the ointment is going to bring the whole thing down. Floodgates are open. We've let the demons loose. The big guns have spoken. And we've fallen for the ruse.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1819. That was the day that Alan Pinkerton was born in Glasgow, Scotland. His father was a policeman who died while Alan was a boy. This left the family in poverty. As a young man, he became involved in the Chartism movement. This reform movement hoped to expand the political rights of the working class in Great Britain. Alan had to flee his homeland to avoid arrest because of his involvement. This led him to Chicago. It is a great historic irony that Alan Pinkerton came to the United States because of his involvement in a working class cause. Today, Pinkertons are often considered some of the greatest armed foes against unionism in U.S. labor history. In Chicago, Pinkerton became involved in law enforcement and then formed his own detective agency. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency made its name working against railway thefts, but it became most notorious for opposing the labor movement. Pinkerton spies infiltrated labor meetings for company owners, worked as hired guns to stop union organizing, and protected strikebreakers. Alan Pinkerton died in 1884 and passed the agency on to his sons. During the 1890s, there were more Pinkertons and reserves than the standing army of the United States. One of the most famous battles between Pinkertons and workers occurred at the 1892 strike against Carnegie Steel in Homestead, Pennsylvania. There, 7 workers and 2 Pinkertons were killed. The event inspired a song by William W. Delaney. The lyrics included the lines, quote, "God help them tonight in their hour of affliction, praying for him who they'll ne'er see again. Hear the poor orphans tell their sad story. Father was killed by a Pinkerton man." For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at laborhistoryin2.
Chances are, when you took a shower this morning, an AFSCME member made sure that water was clean. When you drove to work, an AFSCME member maintained the road. When you rode an elevator, an AFSCME member inspected it. I'm David Philman, Executive Director of AFSCME Council 13, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. AFSCME members enforce regulations, keep prisoners behind bars, take care of patients, protect the environment, and more. The work isn't glamorous, the salaries aren't high, but AFSCME members serve the public in every aspect of our daily lives. Chances are, you'll never see that AFSCME member working in a sewage plant, diving underwater to repair a bridge, or answering a 911 call. But aren't you glad they do? For more information, visit AFSCME13.org. We are AFSCME. We make Pennsylvania happen!
Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind. You can email me, Rick, at thericksmithshow.com. You know, look, the more I look at the last 40 years, the more you look at the attacks on workers' rights to organize, the more you look at, this graph that EPI puts out, where they put, as union density went up, as union membership went up, the share of income going to the top percent went down because, look, the reality is, you are not going to have as wealthy of a wealth class when you have higher density. Because guess what? The amount of that pie, the amount of that economic pie is being distributed somewhat reasonably. Nobody's talking about, and this is where you get with people who have these, you want everyone to be absolutely equal and you're a socialist. And no. People want decent wages, hours, and conditions. They want to be able to support their families. They want to be able to make better opportunities for their children. And you look at the last 30 years, from 1980 when Reagan fired the Patco workers until now, union density has dropped precipitously. And as union density has gone down, the wealth class's consolidation of wealth has just skyrocketed. And what ends up happening is we end up being force-fed boogeymen. It's the immigrants. It's this group. It's that group. Reality is it's our trade deals. Our trade deals are horrible, and I agreed with Donald Trump on this. I just don't think he's going to do anything to correct them. I think actually what he will do is make them worse. He's such a bad negotiator and such a bad president to this point that I think he makes things worse. And all of those people who are his most ardent supporters and most vehement defenders, they're going to be the ones hurt the most. And there's maybe some poetic justice in that. But you look at the attack on workers. Now understand what Trump has done. And for all those people who say, well, Donald's going to, he's going to be great. What he's already done, we can impeach him tomorrow. And he's already done enough damage to last 40 years. The appointment of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court is the death blow to organized labor, to workers being able to organize. Once the Janus v. Afsman case gets decided and we make the public sector a right-to-work sector across the nation, once they undo the Abood decision and they defund the labor movement, what's going to happen is that 6% private sector union density will probably matched with like a 10 to 12% public sector union density, which means we'll go down from 11% density down into the single digits almost immediately. And then the ability to fight for better wages, hours, and conditions will be diminished. And this alligator jaw that's being opened is just going to get wider. And that is the wealth of the top 10%, the wealth of the wealth class, and then union density and desperation down here. At some point, that has to snap back together, be it another depression, be it another wave of organizing. I don't know what the future looks like. But what I do know is we've been fed and we've been led in this direction. It's always somebody else's fault. And I love the people who keep telling me, well, it's all these immigrants. We brought these immigrants in. And you go, yeah, we've been bringing immigrants into this country since the beginning. And in fact, I would argue now we need immigrants probably more than ever because as an aging population, much like Germany has the same problem, as an aging population, you're going to need people to do the low-wage jobs. You're going to need people to wipe the baby boomers' behinds. You need that. And you need people who are going to come in and be okay with being desperate for a generation and be okay with low wages. Because, and again, I keep coming back to knowing people who run small businesses who do those things. Americans don't really want to pick lettuce. They don't want to get out in the fields. And I know there are people who say, well, no, they don't. And for those who point out that, well, the construction industry is being destroyed, it's because our labor laws are being destroyed. Every generation of immigrants that's come into this country has followed that low-wage work path. They've started off doing the dishwashing and working in the fields, and the next generation ends up working in the next skill up. And it's because there's almost no ability today to join and form unions. I mean, we see a couple of victories here and there, but for the most part, the scale is so heavily weighted in favor of the employer class that organizing is damn near impossible, especially if there's an employer who doesn't want their employees to organize. And what they do is they divide us and they tear us apart and point fingers. Someone said, well, the immigrants have destroyed the construction industry. The housing industry, yeah. It's because, again, we haven't organized those industries. Why? Because of the assault. And I point back to Ronald Reagan. The assault on those workers being able to organize. And what's angering and frustrating is every generation's followed that path. And I guess every generation that has immigrated here has had that same kind of hatred pointed at them. I go back to our history. And I go back to labor's history and how this has always been the divider. This has always been what's teared us apart. That slicing and dicing, that pitting workers against each other. These trade deals. And again, I go back to saying, as I said during the campaign, I agree with Donald Trump's assessment that these are horrible trade deals. These trade deals harm workers on both sides of the border. And you go, well, those Mexicans are coming here. Yeah, they're coming here because NAFTA destroyed their farming community. And I have to point out every time I talk about this, that NAFTA made Mexico change their constitution. They had to change their constitution to steal land from communities that was used for farming so that the communities could feed themselves, because it was, well, it was an infringement on the free market. So all of those people who were working the small plots of land, and look, was it corrupt? Sure. But the workers still had jobs. They were still home. When we came in and our big agribusiness just steamrolled over them, basically we were selling corn in their market for less than they could get the seeds, or less than they could plant for corn. It put them out of business. And where would they go? You know, this is what I love about this immigration argument that I get from these nitwits who keep saying, oh, it's those illegals. Where else would you have them go when it's our trade deals that put them in this situation? It's our big businesses. It's our corporate elites. And the other side of this is, ask anyone who actually knows anything about how people come here and how the undocumented worker makes it to the U.S. They've got jobs before they leave Mexico. So instead of pitting us against one another, why not point your anger and your frustration and your rage at the people who are the drivers of the demand? You know, a couple of years ago, we had a guy on the program who had come from southern part of Mexico all the way up to Massachusetts. He was working in a fish house. He had the job before he left Mexico. He knew if he could get to that place in Massachusetts, he would have a job waiting for him. And not just one job, he could have two, working for the same company, working 80 hours a week and no overtime. But guess what? He was undocumented, so he didn't say a word because, well, he might be deported. So he put up with the abuse. He put up with the exploitation. And what that exploitation did is it drove conditions down for everyone. So do I like having 11 million people here in an undocumented fashion? No, not at all. But you have to pull these people out of the shadows, because allowing them to be exploited in the shadows and beaten and mistreated and cheated is bad for all working people. The demand, the drive, the push, corporate America wanting this cheap, exploitable labor, that's where we should be putting our focus. Not on ripping ourselves apart. It's just nuts. It really is just freaking nuts. But yet, it's easier just to point fingers and go, it's them, that's the problem. Getting more in depth to what the actual problems are, that's a little more difficult. Frustrating and angering. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, our good friend Isaiah Poole from People's Action is going to be here. We're going to talk about the events there around Charlottesville and also maybe the shutdown. We're going to shut the government down. What the heck? Because I guess Mexico's still not paying for the wall. Right back.
Take a look at yourself. 10% of the people own 90% of the wealth.
Where smart policy and sound investment matters. The Rick Smith Show.
It's sort of like home on the range where never is heard a discouraging word, and the coal dust isn't toxic all day.
Trump administration halts study on health impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining. New Orleans still grappling with flood emergency as potential hurricane brews in the Gulf of Mexico. Volkswagen is bringing back the iconic minibus, and this time it's electric. Plus, California again proves Trump wrong. Climate regulations actually boost economic growth.
Shocking. All of those stories and more straight ahead. From BradBlog.com, I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
We have become an energy exporter for the first time ever just recently.
That's true. If by recently he means May of 2011. Thanks, Obama. This is your Green News Report. Okay, Desi Doyen, trouble in New Orleans with a hurricane heading its way?
Yeah, kind of. As we go to air, the National Hurricane Center is warning that a new storm, Harvey, is now brewing in the Gulf of Mexico and could drop insane amounts of rain on both Texas and Louisiana. And that's really bad news for the city of New Orleans, which has been in a state of emergency since an early August storm dumped nearly a foot of rain in just 4 hours, causing widespread flooding and forcing city officials to admit that some of the city's pumps have been offline for repairs during peak hurricane season.
Uh-oh.
Yep, now the New Orleans Advocate reports that city officials may evacuate the city if it is forecast to receive more than a foot of rain in a 24-hour period. And by the way, next week is the 12th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina.
Oh, boy.
Meanwhile, scientists are warning the administration's latest move may hurt more than help coal country.
The Trump administration's Interior Department has ordered the National Academies of Sciences to stop work on a study of the health impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining. Mountaintop removal coal mining is exactly like it sounds. It's a method that literally blasts off the tops of mountains, dumping the debris into valleys and streams below where people live. Numerous previous studies have linked mountaintop removal in West Virginia to elevated rates of cancer, heart disease, and birth defects. So state officials requested a federal assessment. Bob Kincaid, founder of West Virginia's Coal River Mountain Watch, in an interview on the broadcast, said the administration's decision to halt this health study shields the coal industry.
They were going to say that there does appear to be a scientific reason to be concerned about the harm that mountaintop removal coal extraction does to people who live near it. And that would have created a controversy and a storm that the coal industry could not have weathered.
Weird. So Donald Trump's claims about how much he loves coal miners is actually not true, because this study might have found that coal mining was killing coal miners and their families. Go figure.
And even worse than that, last week the Environmental Protection Agency announced that it will revoke an Obama-era rule that required operators of coal-fired power plants to limit toxic metals in their wastewater discharge. It seems like this administration really does not want to find out the impacts of coal pollution.
Drink up, coal miners.
But some good news, California's state economy is booming, even as the state has rolled out a host of new regulations to curb carbon emissions and fight climate change.
What?
According to a new report, after implementation of California's landmark cap-and-trade law, statewide per capita emissions fell by 12%. And at the same time, the state's per capita GDP grew at double the national average. For every one fossil fuel job, the state now has 8 renewable energy jobs. And since the launch of cap and trade, California now leads the nation in the number of clean energy patents and is now the most energy productive economy in the world, meaning it uses the least amount of energy for every dollar of economic activity.
So when Donald Trump told us in Phoenix that the Paris Climate Accord would kill jobs, California made him a liar yet again?
Yes, it did.
Not hard to do.
Finally, it's official. German carmaker Volkswagen, while trying to redeem itself after being caught cheating on pollution standards in the U.S. and Europe, announced this week it is bringing back its iconic Volkswagen minibus in 2022. Only this time, that minibus will be all electric.
Cool. How about an electric bug? Where's that?
Hopefully coming soon.
Still waiting on you, Volkswagen. For much more on all of these stories and the many we couldn't get to today, Check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com. Don't forget you can download our reports anytime via Stitcher, TuneIn, or iTunes. Find us, follow us, and share us worldwide on the Facebooks and the Twitters at Green News Report. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
And this has been your Green News Report.
Beep, 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 yeah. Beep, 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 yeah.
Standing tall against a multinational corporate agenda. The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out our website, ricksmithshow.com. So a couple of tweets by the Donald today. The first one, few, if any, administrations have done more in just 7 months than the Trump administration. Bills passed, regulations killed, border, military, ISIS. I assume SC being South Carolina, which I'm going, what did you accomplish there? And then you follow that up with the other tweet, which is if Senate Republicans don't get rid of the filibuster and go to 51% majority, few bills will be passed. 8 Democrats control the Senate. Now, he's been saying that the Democrats have been obstructionist and won't allow anything to get done. I'm confused. Which is it? He's done more than anybody in the history of the country, or that the Democrats are holding him back and he can get nothing done. Just a thought. Anyway, let's find out what's going on around the world with our good friend Isaiah Poole, Communications Director there at People's Action. Isaiah, thanks for taking time for us.
My pleasure.
So which is it? Getting nothing done, or he's the greatest ever?
He's getting things done in the way that a bull would get things done walking through a china shop.
Yep.
It's, when you talk about, he's really just creating more and more wreckage, whether it's through the Interior Department with, this decision impending around Memorial Parks, Bears Ear, and whether some of that parkland is going to turn into more places for fossil fuel development. If you talk about the continuing wreckage, the threat this week that he would pardon Joe Arpaio, even though he didn't do it when he was in Phoenix this week.
Which I think he's still going to do, Isaiah. I think he's going to do it.
Well, he's certainly going to try. There is some question as to whether that's legally possible, but he's certainly going to try, and that is going to be another piece of wreckage because it's going to send a very strong signal that if you are a law enforcement official that disregards the law, Donald Trump has your back.
Now, I thought the presidential pardon was almost...
no consequence for doing the kinds of things that Joe Arpaio has done.
Right.
And I would encourage people, by the way, we have an excellent article on ourfuture.org this morning about Joe Arpaio and the reasons why, if people need to be reminded, why it's important that this man is now being punished and must serve out his term rather than having a pardon from the president.
Right. I'd like to see him in one of his tents in pink underwear. But, here's the thing. I was under the impression that the president's pardon was, there was nothing higher, that he had the right to do it. Are you saying that legally he may not have the right to pardon Arpaio?
Well, there is some discussion about whether the conditions under which Arpaio was sentenced could be undone in this particular case. I don't know the details. I am not a lawyer. I only play one on talk shows. But there is some, I'm hearing some whisperings that this is not it's certainly not within the bounds of or traditionally used.
Yeah, but you could say that Isaiah, that some people, you go back to, the rich pardon under Clinton.
Yeah.
You could look at some of the more questionable pardons of the past and say, this, is this worse than those in your opinion?
I think that's an excellent question. I think in some ways it is worse, but I think certainly the right will certainly make that argument that, look at the pardons that Clinton did or to look at the pardons that Obama did. Certainly there are people on the right who raised all kinds of fuss over some of the Obama Clintons during the last weeks of his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, even the pardon of Richard Nixon, should he have been pardoned? I mean, there's a lot of this stuff. I mean, George Steinbrenner was pardoned for, you can go down the list of a bunch of people that you go, well, how'd that happen? Patty Hearst.
Yeah, but I think, there is, the idea of having a person in law enforcement violating the law is a very special category.
Right. No, but I watched that thing on Tuesday and I go, that was it. That was the dog whistle. He'll be okay. He'll be fine. That was his way of saying it's a done deal. Trust me.
Right. But I also wonder, and to just float this out there, that's a pardon that could, if it wasn't done Tuesday night, could have been done Wednesday morning or Wednesday evening. It hasn't been done yet.
Interesting.
You wonder why.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. Maybe it's they didn't put it on Twitter yet. I mean, he's probably working on it. But here's the thing. I mean, we've now got that, and you compound what this president's already done. I mean, you look at what happened in South Carolina. You look at just the debacle that has been, the wine fest on Tuesday night. Now there's talk we're going to be shutting down the government because...
Oh, yeah, over the wall, exactly.
Evidently, Mexico, maybe they finally figured it out. Mexico ain't paying for it.
Mexico isn't paying for it. A lot of people in Texas don't want to pay for it.
I don't want to pay for it.
Right. And, they said that there are far better ways. If you're concerned about policing the border, there are far better ways to do that than put up a big wall. Why are we not having those on the table rather than being so fixated on a wall? Now, the real problem, of course, is the fact that, we are terrorizing immigrant communities around the country through ICE raids and so on. And we are disrupting people's lives and disrupting communities without really making them safe.
Yeah, but
in the meantime, we cannot keep our Navy ships from running into stuff in the middle of the ocean. If you're concerned about safety.
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm concerned about the possibility of it being hacked and that being part of it. But here's the thing. On the immigration front, you've got people who say, well, Isaiah, it's killing our wages. It's killing low-wage work. They're American workers who want those jobs.
Actually, there's plenty of evidence that that's not the case, that, in fact, a robust immigrant community that is empowered to actually legally get jobs and live out from under the shadows is a net plus to these communities. In fact, they help create jobs. They help create communities, keep communities vibrant. And we've seen that over and over and over again. I think in your own state, Rick, in Pennsylvania, you've seen some examples of communities that try to impose very harsh conditions on immigrant neighborhoods, and have seen that economically backfire.
Yeah, and the guy who did that ends up being my congressman.
Yeah, because we're not having a really intelligent discussion about that.
Yeah, he ended up bailing on Hazleton, Pennsylvania, left them with huge debt and huge problems. But now he's my congressman.
Right, but I do think though that if we as Democrats and progressives get our act together, start fielding strong kind of talk that Donald Trump is doing about shutting down the government over the border wall. We've got the debt ceiling issue coming up, where, again, Donald Trump is going to have to decide whether he's going to kowtow to the Freedom Caucus or act like he's got some common sense. I am convinced, I hope this is not true, but I am convinced that that Donald Trump is going to make such a serious mistake that this good ride that he has gotten on the economy so far is going to be gone in 2018.
No, I agree. And I'll go a step further, Isaiah. My fear, and I talked about this yesterday, my fear is that there's nobody really at the switch. I don't think he's taking the daily briefings. I fear we're reliving August of 2001.
Oh, yeah. I have that fear as well. And, I think the best that we can do is prepare the ground for, first of all, taking out this Republican Congress, because the Republican Congress has proven totally incapable up to now of serving as a check. It's bumbled. It could not, thank God, could not pass the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, but they've been bumbling idiots up to now, rather than an effective check on the president and his worst instincts.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, we just live in really crazy times. I got a couple minutes left. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. To look at South Carolina, the monuments and all that. Evidently, the Republican Party in Virginia got themselves into hot water yesterday, and I don't know if you saw this, but they tweeted out about the Democratic gubernatorial nominee, this Ralph Northam.
Yeah.
And they tweeted out that, quote, Ralph Northam has turned his back on his own family's heritage in demanding monument removal. Do you take this as kind of this generation's pointing out that he's a race traitor? Do you buy that?
Well, I do, and also it just shows another example of how we don't know history. I read a few days ago a letter that Robert E. Lee wrote after the Civil War, in which he was asked about coming up to Gettysburg to mark the places where Confederate soldiers died for the purpose of building monuments. And he said that he was not going to do that. And one of the reasons he was not going to do that was because he felt that it was important not to have memorials to the Civil War and to the divisions that were there. We had the war, the issue should be settled, the country should unite and move on. That was Robert E. Lee.
Right. But, look, these monuments weren't put into place, in my view, and you can agree or disagree, they weren't put into place to memorialize the Civil War. They were put into place to put, something, to put it in people's faces, especially minorities and blacks in the South, to ram it in their face or basically rub their noses in it.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think our insistence that these monuments remain up and these Confederate flags remain up, even though time and time again we've highlighted how much pain these monuments and these flags cause to communities of color and how they stand as monuments to white supremacy. The fact that you would insist on having these monuments up and talk, as the president does, about, quote, protecting our heritage, when you know that is code language for white supremacy. The fact that you would do that, I mean, it's shameful, disgusting. I don't have words for it. And it's sickening that, 54 years, we're coming up on 54 years after the March on Washington, 1963 March on Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And in 2017, we're having this discussion.
It's amazing stuff. On Tuesday's event, were you surprised? And I guess maybe it's just me. I saw Elvira King there, the niece of Martin Luther King, and I had to think, is that the dream?
I'm not surprised that I'm not surprised that there are, this handful of people. I mean, one of the things that's interesting was if you watch the speech, there was that guy who was holding up the Trump Blacks for Trump.
He was planted there.
Yes, but the man is absolutely crazy. I mean, if you go to his website, it's all nonsense. And not only that, the guy actually was once a member. Daily Kos highlighted this, and other folks have been part of a violent cult. How he gets past Secret Service is beyond me.
But isn't that the entire Trump base?
There have always been historically a handful of people that in the African American community that white people have held up as examples of good Negroes that they are willing to embrace because they will not challenge the status quo.
Yeah, well, I mean, my favorite picture on Twitter was the black guy with the Confederate flag and the white guy with the Black Lives Matter sign. We have really interesting times. Isaiah, it's just mind-blowing. I appreciate the time. I look forward to talking to you again next week.
All right. Take care.
As always, our good friend Isaiah Poole, People's Action. Check out their websites. We'll get links at thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back to wrap things up. Stick around.
The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1925. 500 African-American sleeping car porters gathered at the Elks Hall at 129th Street in Harlem. The meeting was called by A. Philip Randolph. The purpose of the meeting was to form an independent black labor union for the sleeping car workers. The porters were service workers on the popular Pullman train sleeping cars. They were paid low wages and worked as many as 400 hours a month with no overtime pay. They could not be promoted to other jobs within the Pullman Company. Those were reserved for white workers. They faced daily acts of discrimination on the job. Many of the porters became increasingly determined to change these working conditions by forming a union. There was a company union, but it did not represent the demands of the workers. But talking about an independent porters union was a good way to get fired from the Pullman Company. A group of porters reached out to a young black rights activist, A. Philip Randolph. They asked him to lead the union charge. As an outsider to the company, he could be the face of the union without facing the threat of being fired. Randolph accepted their offer. He organized the meeting in Harlem. An American flag and large Union banner draped the stage. Randolph opened the meeting with a prayer as temperatures in the packed room soared to 90 degrees. From the stage, Randolph issued a rallying cry for reduced hours, increased wages, and most importantly, dignity at the workplace. It would take 12 long years of struggle after that meeting, but the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters would become the nation's first black labor union. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2.
Making the blue blood see red. The Rick Smith Show.
I tweeted out the picture I mentioned to Isaiah. It's one of those things that I just thought was kind of ironic, kind of funny, kind of bizarre all at the same time. And look, I saw the story on Robert E. Lee's letter, and from a general's perspective, from someone who truly back then said, I want what's best for the country, knowing that having that constant reminder of what had torn this country apart was not a good thing. And yet you've got, the president who's saying, our history, our heritage. No, that's not the history and the heritage that we should be honoring. We should remember it, but it's not what you honor. And I tweeted out a couple of days ago that, these kind of characters in our history are not people you remember positively. There are no statues to Benedict Arnold. Maybe, who knows? Maybe now the right wing will go, hey, let's have a couple of statues of Benedict Arnold. Maybe, who knows? Maybe we'll have a couple of Hitler statues. Who knows? Who knows how far and how crazy the right wing in this country has gotten, and the haters have gotten. I mean, it's really just truly bizarre that in this day and age, that you would have people who would be defending Nazis. I mean, it's mind-blowing to me. Just mind-blowing. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do we need monuments to the Confederates? Is it our heritage to be remembered, or is it just rubbing people's nose in it? You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. The watchdog group Citizens for Ethics and Responsibility in Washington, or CREW, people we've had on the program a number of times. Evidently, they've filed a Freedom of Information Act request around the records of what it cost our Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and his wife to go up in a government plane on Monday, just around the time of the eclipse. Now, there are some who are saying, well, they wanted a higher view. They wanted to get a better view. And all what broke loose on Monday when evidently the wife, actress Lois Linton, drew some ire on social media when she posted a picture of herself in her designer outfit with the government plane in the background. And one Instagram person said, hey, glad we could pay for your little getaway, #deplorable, to which she replied, pretty sure the amount we sacrifice per year is a lot more than you'd be willing to sacrifice if the choice was yours. You're adorable. You're adorably out of touch. She later apologized for the comments. Oops, probably shouldn't have done that. But now you've got CREW who's saying, hey, we'd really like to know if we just paid for Mnuchin and his wife, because understand, he's close to a billionaire, if not a billionaire. He could pay for his own plane ride if we, the people, paid for the flight, for him to go up at the right time to be able to see the eclipse at the right angle, rather than what other people do, use commercial airlines. I know, way below them. And, when did the Treasury Secretary be up enough on the food chain to be able to get a private government plane? Look, if he wants to use his own private plane, all in favor of it. Bless you. And we'll even pay the $500 that you would have paid for a commercial flight. Lots of fun, entertainment, and craziness. I'm waiting for what happens over the weekend. Cannot wait to get back on Monday to talk about, the Twitter is going to continue, the insanity going to continue, the fire hose, the frenzy, going to continue. If you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com. That's where you go to get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go, wherever you're going. As always, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Have a great weekend. Take a little break. Breathe a little bit. Enjoy it. It's going to be beautiful. And then back to the insanity on Monday. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you Monday.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Together, we can make America better. Email rick@thericksmithshow.com or interact with us anytime at thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.